Let me welcome you all to the commemoration of the Battle for Guadalcanal. This program is a special program today, and today is the anniversary of the 71st year since we landed Americans on Guadalcanal, the very first offensive action by the United States after Pearl Harbor. Our program in a minute will bring on the colors, and Liam Turner will lead us in singing our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Could I have our Guadalcanal veterans please stand, and we're going to recognize you and toast you. I see Johnny Johnson there from the USS San Francisco. To our Guadalcanal veterans, everybody drink up. A special program written by a Marine. Mike Saray was a Vietnam-era Marine, wounded there, and he became a journalist with ABC News, and he got an Emmy Award in 2003 after his coverage for the markup. But he's so taken by the significance of the Battle for Guadalcanal that he wrote the program that you're going to hear now. Now I'm going to introduce the Master of Ceremonies for this program, and then I'm going to play a little Victory at Sea music before he starts talking. But it's former Coast Guard Captain Larry Graham, and you know, the Coast Guard played a significant role in Guadalcanal, and you'll hear about that.
I didn't want to get in the way of that stirring music, and it truly is stirring. And General, thank you for your introduction. And there's no question about it, I'm incredibly honored to be here to be the Master of Ceremonies. And on behalf of our cast and all of those whose contributions made today possible, I want to tell you that for all of us, this is considered to be a very special program. It's USS San Francisco and the Battle for Guadalcanal. What better prelude to this afternoon's program than the opening to Victory at Sea by Richard Rodgers. It's synonymous with the heroism and the many Allied victories at sea during World War II. But 71 years ago, there weren't a lot of victories in the Pacific Theater to write soundtracks for, and very few people had ever heard of a place called Guadalcanal. On and around this obscure speck in the Pacific, a 6-month-long series of land, sea, and air battles came to a dramatic and violent head on November 13th, 1942. The outcome of those battles turned the complete tide of the war in the Pacific. The first time I heard of Guadalcanal was during the war, when my father gave me a copy, a little ratty now, of Guadalcanal Diary. It was Richard Tregasky's classic account of what happened on Guadalcanal. I would stay up late at night rereading that book. I was mesmerized by the personal accounts of so many young men fighting and dying so far away from home and under such miserable conditions. If it wasn't their fighting the more experienced and acclimated Japanese forces, it was the tropical diseases, the shortage of supplies, of food, and of ammunition, and the lack of reinforcements that threatened to make their short lives even shorter. Today we're going to take you back to Guadalcanal on that fateful night of Friday the 13th. That's when the efforts of nearly 60,000 American sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, and Coast Guardsmen came to such a dramatic climax. Like the rest of their brothers in arms, they were merely ordinary people trying to do the extraordinary for their country and for each other.
After Pearl Harbor, Japan's campaign to take control of strategic islands and countries throughout the Pacific went virtually unchecked through the first half of 1942. It would take months for the U.S. to build up enough troops and equipment before it could mount any serious offensive in the Pacific. After all, Roosevelt pledged to Churchill to make Europe first. In the interim, the Japanese managed to take control of the Western Pacific as far south as the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, an American reconnaissance plane spotted the Japanese constructing an island airfield from which they could cut off the sea lanes between the U.S. and Australia. This is where the American Joint Chiefs of Staff drew their line in the sand on an island most Americans had never heard of, Guadalcanal. Ready or not, elements of the 1st Marine Division shipped out of San Francisco, still short of one of its 3 regiments. Also short on training, equipment, and experienced officers and NCOs, they would be the tip of the spear for the first Allied ground offensive in the Pacific. The USS San Francisco, one of the few heavy cruisers lucky enough to have escaped the carnage at Pearl Harbor, was made the flagship for one of 2 naval task forces dispatched to Guadalcanal to support the Marines and keep their lifeline open. The officers and men of the San Francisco had mostly been protecting troop ship convoys and had yet to have had a major conflict with the enemy.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlie Bates. My uncle, Gene Witter, served on the USS San Francisco during the Battle for Guadalcanal 71 years ago. This year, the USS San Francisco was known to be a lucky ship for having survived Pearl Harbor with only a smashed searchlight. Less of an act of divine providence, it was more the result of targeting the battleships at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese concentrated on taking out our big 16-inch guns. San Francisco was a heavy cruiser with smaller 8-inch guns. Her skipper, after Pearl Harbor, was Captain Daniel J. Callahan, San Francisco native. He graduated from St. Ignatius High School and went on to the Naval Academy. Prior to taking command of the San Francisco, he spent 3 years as a naval aide to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Callahan served aboard the San Francisco for a second time in October 1942. This time, it was the Rear Admiral and the commander of the Special Task Force, created by Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey. His mission, locate and stop the Japanese naval force controlling the area around Guadalcanal. Another Naval Academy man aboard that night was Bruce McCandless. He had recently been promoted to lieutenant commander. His first experience with the San Francisco's, good luck, came a month earlier in the Battle of Cape Esperance. It was one of the first encounters with the Japanese task force in the slot, the straits leading to Guadalcanal. Once again, San Francisco survived with barely a scratch. Officially, McCandless was the ship's communication officer. But when Admiral Callahan returned to the ship as the task force commander with his staff on the flag bridge, McCandless volunteered to move up to the con bridge, where the ship's movement was controlled. His new duties were as officer of the deck. The junior officer, or navigator aboard the ship, was my uncle, Gene Witter, Jr. His father, Gene, and his cousin, Dean, co-founded Dean Witter and Company in San Francisco. Gene was always my role model while I was growing up in the East Bay, thanks to his sister, my mother, Nancy Witter. Star football player in Piedmont High, Gene went on to Cal, where he was recognized as one of the top rugby players in the country. That's how the Cal football team discovered him, as did the Detroit Lions during his senior year. A defensive lineman, he was as quick as he was tenacious. Just a month before Pearl Harbor, he was the one who blocked Frankie Albert's punt in the big game with his face. No face guards. The ball hit his face, bounced off, went into the end zone for a safety, and the underdog Cal beat Stanford in 1941. However, only 6 months later, in May 1942, he graduated from Cal, received his Navy commission, married his high school sweetheart, Beatty, and headed across the Pacific aboard the USS San Francisco, all in a course of 10 days. Like I said, he was quick and tenacious. My mother saved his letters, describing his life aboard the Lucky San Francisco, which among other things described how an enemy torpedo glanced off her side without exploding. In his letter written June 8th to his parents, he wrote, "Being a navigator, I spent most of my time up in the chart house next to the bridge. Most of the high-ranking officers aboard the ship hold their bull sessions up there, and I'm able to listen in." However, military censors wouldn't allow him to write about where he was or where he was going. But in his letter of November 8th, 1942, to his family, he made reference to a change of a command party aboard the ship, which matches when Captain Casey Young, a Medal of Honor recipient during Pearl Harbor, took over command, and Admiral Callahan and his task force came aboard. He also refers to his Piedmont High School buddy, Larry Taylor, who had just become a Marine and was recently killed in action in Guadalcanal. He went on to mention how sorry he was to missing the upcoming holidays and Christmas with his family, especially with his new bride. As a matter of fact, I'd better wish you all a Merry Christmas. I'll be thinking of all of you during Christmas, just like it has always been in the past. Stockings, the processional downstairs, the tree, the always generous Santa Claus, and family dinner with all of you. Your letter, Mother, told me about Beatty's birthday party. Gosh, but it made me homesick that I couldn't be there with you, especially when you say how pretty Beatty looked. It's really tough to be away, but of course, I knew what I was getting into. When I look about and see our responsibilities and the sacrifice others are making, there is really no foundation for anything else other than to keep on plugging and to try to end this war as soon as possible. I never hoped to have make the sacrifice that Larry did, but as Dad says, everything short of that is a victory. So I feel fortunate, not as much as some of those back home, but still fortunate. Exciting times these are. Your loving son, Gene.
Eight months to the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division launched the Allies' first ground offensive in the Pacific on the islands of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Enemy resistance on Tulagi was much stronger than on Guadalcanal. This is where the untested Marines got their first taste of how difficult it would be to flush the Japanese out of their jungle fighting holes and cave complexes, one captured island at a time, all the way to Iwo Jima. By the second day, the Marines had seized the airfield in progress on Guadalcanal. Using abandoned Japanese construction equipment, they completed it and named it Henderson Field, after a Medal of Honor Marine aviator killed in the Battle of Midway. While still trying to bring their equipment and supplies ashore, the Japanese struck back with a crippling airstrike on the Marines' supply ships. Combined with intelligence reports of a naval counterattack, the Navy ships made a hasty withdrawal to the safety of the open sea. Still aboard, more than half of the Marine supplies, including most of their heavy equipment, artillery, and 1,000 troops. The Marines ashore had landed with only a 4-day supply of ammunition and 2 weeks of food. Operation Watchtower was now called Operation Shoestring. The Marines had to ration everything and live off whatever the Japanese left behind. Defensive perimeters were dug by hand around Henderson Field and the key beach landings. The barbed wire was salvaged from cattle fences. The Japanese Army still controlled the majority of this 90-mile-long island, and the Japanese Navy controlled the waters around it. This allowed the Japanese to reinforce their troops for their eventual counteroffensive. They shipped troops down the slot from their base in Rabaul on thunder runs at night on what became known as the Tokyo Express. On the way out, they pounded the Marines ashore with naval gunfire. Surrounded by the enemy, cut off from their supply lines, and battling the unforgiving tropical conditions, they decided the best defense was a good offense and took the fight to the Japanese. The 1st Marine Division's determination and courage made Guadalcanal indelible in the minds of all Americans.
Since 1943, the 1st Marine Division's emblem and shoulder patch is a blue diamond around a red number 1 with the name Guadalcanal stitched on it. Some Marines even have that emblem tattooed on their arm. That's how important Guadalcanal Marines are to every Marine who's followed them. Samuel Griffith, the military historian and commander of the 1st Raider Battalion on Guadalcanal, described the 1st Marine Division this way. They were a motley bunch. Hundreds were young recruits, only recently out of boot training at Parris Island. Others were older. First sergeants yanked off planks in Navy yards, sergeants from recruiting duty, gunnery sergeants who'd fought in France, perennial privates with disciplinary records a yard long. These all salts knew their weapons and they knew their tactics. They knew they were tough and they knew they were good. The Marines were well aware of the Japanese no prisoners philosophy on both sides of the battlefield. The Japanese were also considered to be masters of the art of concealment and jungle fighting. In fact, leading up to Guadalcanal, many Americans harbored serious doubts that any American force would be able to defeat the Japanese in such an alien jungle environment. But then again, the Japanese had never gotten up close and personal with the U.S. Marines. The 1st Marine Division's original plans for training and invasion rehearsals were cut from 6 months to only 4 weeks. Their supplies and ammunition were cut to less than 2 weeks so that they could get to Guadalcanal as quickly as possible before the Japanese could make the airfield operational. After the Marines landed on the 7th of August, without the Marine Division's 7th Regiment, which was still in Samoa, the Japanese began landing reinforcements for counterattacks. They quickly began testing the Marines with human wave and bayonet charges, mostly at night. One of the most frustrating situations for the Marines was the constant naval bombardments. The Marines could see and hear the Japanese ships, but they couldn't hit back because they didn't have their heavy artillery. General Vandergrift, the 1st Marine Division's commanding general, moved his command post away from Henderson Field to escape the nightly shelling and bombing of the airfield. He said in his memoirs that he had to, just so that he could get a decent night's sleep. On a more serious note, he also wrote about having personally experienced shell shock, similar to what many of his Marines had suffered from the effects of naval gunfire. Instead of just playing defense, the Marines tried to keep the Japanese off balance and to upset their offensive plans for a counterattack by conducting aggressive patrols. General Vandergrift dispatched Colonel Evans Carlson and his 2nd Raider Battalion on a 30-day patrol to locate and harass Japanese units threatening the Marine southern perimeter. Lessons learned from Carlson's patrol continue to be taught in Marine training today. One of his company commanders was Major James Roosevelt, the son of the President of the United States. But rank had few privileges on Guadalcanal. The unforgiving jungle conditions felled 1 in 5 Marines with dysentery and tropical diseases like dengue fever and malaria. The Marines would affectionately call Guadalcanal this stinking island. Guadalcanal was also the first time American forces would take on the Japanese in such close quarters and in hand-to-hand combat. On the night of September 14th, up on the ridge that formed the final line of defense for Henderson Field, Edson's regiment, under the leadership of Colonel Myatt Edson, had to repulse multiple human wave charges by the Japanese with fixed bayonets. When Edson learned that his Marines were running out of ammunition and might not be able to hold their positions until daybreak, he called in artillery dangerously close to his regiment's position. Here is how Richard Tregasky described the morning after the battle for Edson's Ridge in his book, Guadalcanal Diary. The hill was quiet now. Small fires smoldered in the grass. There were black burned patches where Jap grenades had burst. The Marines along the slope of the hill watched us quietly as we passed. They looked dirty and worn. Along the flank of the hill, we passed bodies of Marines and Japs, sometimes tangled as they had fallen in a death struggle. At the top of a hill, the dead Marines lay close together. On the steep slope, there were more than 200 Jap bodies, many of them torn and shattered by grenades and artillery.
The most beautiful sight I had ever seen. That's how the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division described the arrival of the 1st Marine Squadron at Henderson Field. 13 days after the invasion, the Marines on the ground were desperate for some air support and some payback for the constant Japanese naval bombardment and airstrikes. Nicknamed the Cactus Air Force after the code name for Guadalcanal, the Marines would eventually be joined by Navy and Army Air Corps pilots scavenged from units throughout the Western Pacific. Their operations center was a commandeer building they affectionately called the Pagoda. With typical gallows humor, they like to say, if it had wings, it flew. If it flew, it fought. If it fought very long, something was certain to happen to it. The Japanese greeted the opening of Henderson Field with a carrier full of planes on the first day it was open for business. Aerial combat with the faster and more maneuverable Japanese Zeros became a daily affair. The slower American Wildcats had to make up the difference with new tactics, which they literally created on the fly. The Marines on the ground maintained a scoreboard at the end of the runway. The final score for the Guadalcanal campaign: Wildcats 42, Zeros 41 downed planes. But the Cactus Air Force's primary mission was to keep the Japanese Navy from reinforcing their troops and shelling the Marines, which the Americans managed to do during daylight. At night, it was the Japanese turn to shell Henderson Field in an attempt to knock out its planes and runway. The Cactus Air Force pilots took it personally, especially the noisy bombers they'd nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie and Louie the Louse, which also denied them of their sleep. The next day, ground crews managed to repair the runways, salvage parts, and siphon fuel from wrecked aircraft to keep the ragtag Cactus Air Force flying. Yet another day on Guadalcanal.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Kendrick. My uncle Charles Kendrick was one of those first 21 pilots to land under fire at Henderson Field on the morning of August 20th, 1942. The legendary Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 223 would have come earlier, but had to wait till their fellow Marines on the ground could complete just enough runway to enable their Grumman F-4F Wildcats to land. They arrived at Henderson Field not a minute too soon. The very next morning, the Japanese came up the shoreline in landing craft, threatening to outflank the Marines' perimeter. 223's fighters went aloft, and their strafing decimated the Japanese counterattack. That same day, 13 Zeros attacked 4 Wildcats. All 4 Wildcats made it back, though full of holes. 1 Zero did not. Such lopsided odds were typical, often 5 to 1 or worse. At times, the pilots were on the ground only long enough to refuel and then get airborne again to engage the next onslaught. Ever more hordes of Zeros and Betty bombers. Over the course of the next 7 weeks, flying daily combat missions, plus scrambling 2 to 3 times each day to dogfight the ways of incoming Zeros, VMF 223 shot down 95 enemy planes. Marine Lieutenant Charles Kendrick shot down 9 of them and became one of America's first aces in the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz personally awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross on a surprise one-day visit to Guadalcanal, during which Admiral Nimitz was nearly killed twice. Recognizing America's entry into the war was inevitable, my uncle had traded law school at Harvard for flight school at Jacksonville. Growing up, he had exasperated his father, also named Charles Kendrick, by repeatedly using the family Garwood speedboat to buzz and swamp the Tahoe Queen. Now, he had found a more productive outlet for his daredevilry as a Marine fighter pilot. VMF 223 played a critical role in support of the Marines' tenuous hold on Henderson Field. At one point, with only 1 wing load of fuel each, having siphoned all they could from disabled planes, the pilots were issued rifles in the event of a forced retreat into the mountains. The pilots slept in muddy slit trenches along with the infantry. The weather alternated between sweltering humidity and torrential rains. At times, their dirt strips mud was so deep, the suction made it hard for their Wildcats to lift off, let alone land. Crocodiles infested the rivers at each end of the runway. The mosquitoes were so large, one ground crewman claimed to have pumped 50 gallons of gasoline into one before realizing his mistake. The Marine aviators were as tough as their Marine brethren on the ground. One downed pilot managed to make his way back to Henderson Field after surviving 10 days in the jungle by eating ants. Along the way, he killed 2 enemy soldiers with the butt of his pistol and a 3rd with a rock. Somehow, despite all the hardships, shelling, and dogfights in Guadalcanal, my uncle still found time to write home. Wednesday, September 8, 1942, Marine Corps Base, Guadalcanal, SI. Dearest Mother and Dad, sometimes when the night has come, the alerts and scrambles of the anxious day secured at last, we're a little surprised to find ourselves still here. When I've not written you for several days, and evening alarms or exhaustion keep me from the task, I tried to make up for it early the next morning before the mail flies out. But the air of the hangar is too full of tension. Plans and recapitulations, the earnest watching of the clouds, forming, dissolving, riding past in the steady trades to pile up in mountains behind, judging constantly the amount and thickness of the overcast, listening for the telephone that will send us scrambling down the field. I can't do it, yet I'm uneasy all day over every opportunity missed. Well, here tonight, in the aerological office corner of the base radio shack, about the only place artificial light is permitted, I can relax and talk to you. The grim reality of daily aerial combat and nightly bombardment took a heavy toll on my uncle's squadron. Of the original 21 pilots, only 9 were still flying when VMF 223 was finally relieved. My Uncle Charles was not among them. His luck had run out the day before when 8 Zeros dived on him out of the sun.
I'm Mark Wilson, and this was my father Ed Wilson's flight jacket. He passed away last year. And Steve's Uncle Charles and my father, to bring this all together, were co-captains of their Naval Flight School together at Jacksonville, Florida at the same time. I'd like to also acknowledge Dick Burris, who I believe is here in the audience today. Dick was one of Dad's best friends and decorated Marine, was part of the invasion force of Iwo Jima, and essentially also it was because of the Marines that my father had a 21-gun salute last year at his funeral. So way to go, Marines. First in, always. My father's SBD dive bomber squadron, VB-11, was headed to the USS Hornet, where he was ready to live out his dream of being one of those dashing carrier pilots flying missions by day and watching movies at night. Not so. But the first Hornet was sunk before he and his squadron could get there, and they were diverted to Henderson Field. In the diary he kept while flying with the Cactus Air Force, he summed it up this way. We were bombed every night. The food was lousy, there was mud everywhere, and we slept in tents or in ditches in the ground. The first thing they told us was not to waste our time to kill all the scorpions crawling over our bodies. We called it Carrier Appreciation Tour. His gunnery mate, Harry Jesperson, lied about his age when he was only 17, not to mention more than a foot shorter than my 6'4" father. Harry flew in the back of their SBD torpedo bomber, and their primary mission was to stop the Japanese ships that kept on hammering the Marines and the Tokyo Express that kept reinforcing the troops on Guadalcanal. This is how he described one of their missions with the Cactus Air Force. After breaking through the clouds, I saw a Japanese destroyer, so I dove on it. Since we were the only plane they saw, everybody was shooting at us. I never saw so much flak and tracers flying by me. When I dropped my bomb at 600 feet, the concussion really rocked me. As I pulled out, I saw another ship shooting at me. Harry, my gunner, looked back and said, we hit the destroyer just aft of midships, which pleased me greatly. What did not please me was a large shrapnel hole I spotted on my left wing near our auxiliary fuel tank. But we saw some landing craft landing Jap troops ashore, and I hit them with my 50 caliber machine guns until I ran out of ammunition. I made another run at them on our port side so Harry could get them with his 30 caliber machine guns until he too ran out of ammo. All the time they were firing their rifles and pistols at us. When we finally landed, my wheels had no more touched the ground when my engine quit. We had run out of fuel and a tractor had to pull us off the runway. The Australian Coast Guard watcher Reg Evans, who helped rescue JFK and his PT-109 crew, confirmed the destroyer my father hit sunk the next day. Unlike Steve's Uncle Charles, my father did survive his tour on Guadalcanal. He and his squadron mates celebrated their San Francisco homecoming in true carrier pilot style. They flew under both bridges, the Golden Gate and Bay Bridge, They then proceeded to the top of the Mark, where at the Mark Hopkins, where many believe the tailhooker's tradition of carousing began.
November 12, 1942. American ships, protected by the San Francisco's task force, unload long-awaited reinforcements and supplies for the Marines cut off on Guadalcanal. Just after 2 in the afternoon, and with little advance warning, Japanese aircraft started their attack. Admiral Callahan ordered the San Francisco and the rest of his ships to form a defensive perimeter around the vulnerable transports. Along with the Cactus Air Force, they managed to hold off the enemy planes, which included 25 torpedo bombers flying just above the water to avoid the American planes and anti-aircraft fire. Gun crews fired into the water in a desperate attempt to stop the incoming planes with plumes of water. One Japanese plane got through and crashed into the San Francisco, wiping out one of its anti-aircraft crews, causing a huge gasoline-fed fire. 24 were killed and 45 wounded. Later that night, one of the few ships in the task force, equipped with the relatively new radar technology, picked up multiple contacts dead ahead. What they did not know was exactly how many or how big the approaching ships were. The Japanese task force commander thought the American ships had left the area with the transports after the afternoon's air attack. They reloaded their guns with high explosive ammunition for their primary objective, taking out Henderson Field once and for all so they could launch their counteroffensive on Guadalcanal. Just after midnight, Callahan ordered his task force to change course and to head directly towards the oncoming ships. At 01:30 on the morning of the 13th, on this moonless night, the two opposing task forces literally ran right through each other and started firing from both sides of their ships.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Baumgartner, Commander U.S. Navy retired. As a former gunnery officer in USS Los Angeles, a heavy cruiser with 9 8-inch guns like the San Francisco, it's even difficult for me to comprehend the ferocity of the naval battle that ensued in the defense of Guadalcanal. The Chief of Naval Operations at the time called it one of the most furious sea battles ever fought. The men aboard San Francisco described it even more poignantly as the 4th of July in hell. Now, during the afternoon of November 12th, 1942, American planes had spotted a large Japanese task force headed for Guadalcanal. The task force was intent on taking out the Marine Air Base at Henderson Field as a prelude to taking back the entire island. Admiral Callahan, aboard his flagship, San Francisco, calculated that he would have to stop them sometime during the night. After midnight on the 13th, the Americans' initial radar contacts indicated 14 to 16 enemy ships approaching, but gave no indication as their size and class. Now let me explain that this radar was extremely primitive. The antenna was mounted on the ship's axis. In order to get a bearing, you had to change the ship's course. But there was an advantage because of the intelligence that the Japanese were headed for Henderson Field. And as a result, Callahan ordered his ship's columns, including the 2 that had radar on board, to head right down the slot, and that's when they picked up the contacts. But the radar was so primitive that they couldn't tell how many ships and how big they were. But they did know that they're about to engage in a night battle. After the enemy force turned out to be 14 ships, 2 of them battleships, each with 8 14-inch guns and 14 6-inch guns, plus a light cruiser, and 11 destroyers, with the deadly long-lance torpedoes. The biggest guns Admiral Callahan's task force had were 8-inch guns. He was seriously outgunned as well as outnumbered. The best he could do was to cut in front of the Japanese task force and block hard. Now, the Navy could ill afford to lose many more ships, especially around Guadalcanal, where they had only one clear victory out of 3 face-offs with the Japanese Navy. Halsey nevertheless sent Callahan's task force to Guadalcanal, knowing it was the Allies' only chance to keep the Japanese from retaking it and cutting off the American supply lines to Australia. Callahan boldly ordered his ships to change course and to head directly towards the oncoming radar contacts, which is an obvious thing that he had to do. This is suicide. That's how San Francisco skipper, Captain Casson Young, reportedly reacted to the order. Bear in mind that Captain Young had been awarded a Medal of Honor for his courage at Pearl Harbor and was hardly a timid sort of officer. According to others on the bridge at that night, Admiral Callahan calmly responded as if resigned to their fate. I know, but we have to do it. A few minutes later, at 01:43, while closing on each other at a combined rate of 40 knots, the lead American destroyers nearly collided with their Japanese counterparts. Not until 01:50, when flashes from the Japanese big guns, along with their massive searchlights, lit up the sky, did both task forces really fully realize that they were running right through each other. Along with the initial element of surprise, with the primitive radar capabilities which the Japanese did not have, the outgunned Americans also had a major ordnance advantage. The Japanese had loaded their big guns with general-purpose projectiles for the bombardment of Guadalcanal, instead of armor-piercing projectiles that they would have loaded if they had known they were going into a naval gunfight. Adding to the fog of war chaos that night was the use of a single radio channel called TBS, shared by Admiral Callahan and all of the ship's captains. His orders to commence and cease firing, to change course, all went out to all ships simultaneously, causing considerable confusion as to which ships the orders were intended for. As the battle commenced, many of the ship's captains ignored or didn't hear Callahan's orders. Thus, this had a tragic consequence for one of the American cruisers, the Atlanta, flagship of Rear Admiral Norman Scott. It was mistakenly shelled by San Francisco as well as by the Japanese destroyers that eventually left her in a sinking condition. At 01:53, San Francisco started taking fire from the first Japanese battleship. Admiral Callahan's last reported order came through loud and clear. Go for the big ones. I want you to go for the big ones first.
When the battle finally ended that night, Task Force Commander Admiral Callahan, San Francisco's Captain Casson Young, his junior navigator Ensign Gene Witter, were all killed by a direct hit on the command bridge from where they were operating. Lieutenant Commanders McCandless and Schoenlin took command of the ship and were able to keep San Francisco afloat. In the dark of night, they managed to guide her back along the Guadalcanal coast to rejoin the rest of the task force. At dawn, on that fateful Friday the 13th, a Japanese submarine spotted her. Unable to maneuver, all that the crew of the Lucky San Francisco could do was to helplessly watch as torpedoes passed ahead of the ship and safely beneath the ship. Tragically, however, they went on to hit and sink the already crippled cruiser USS Juneau. She lost nearly 700 crew members, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. On the morning of the 13th, the Cactus Air Force was back in the air to finish off the Japanese battleship, the first the Japanese would lose in the war, as well as the Japanese troop transports that had been beached in the Japanese last desperate attempt to retake Guadalcanal. One night later, battleships USS Washington and South Dakota sank the second Japanese battleship of the war, Kirishima. Having taken 45 direct hits, San Francisco sadly lost 108 crew members, but managed to limp back to Espiritu Santo for repairs. This was the first time that 2 American flag officers were killed in a single battle. Reportedly, a very emotional Admiral Halsey took the stars from his collar and sent them to their widows. Commanders McCandless, Schoenlin, and Admiral Callahan were awarded Medals of Honor for their action that night 71 years ago. McCandless's son Bruce followed his father's path to the Naval Academy and became the first astronaut to make an untethered spacewalk. Now, no longer cut off by the Japanese Navy, the Marines on Guadalcanal were reinforced and eventually replaced by the 2nd Marine Division, the Army's 25th Infantry, and Americal divisions. The 1st Marine Division was given the Presidential Unit Citation, and 11 of its members, including its commanding general, General Vandergriff, were awarded Medals of Honor, as was VMF 223's commanding officer, Major John L. Smith. Signalman First Class Douglas Monroe earned the Coast Guard's first and only Medal of Honor for braving enemy fire several times in his landing craft to rescue a Marine unit pinned down on the beach at Guadalcanal. His last words before he succumbed to his wounds asked, "Did we get them off?" The Witter family received a telegram from the Navy Department on Thanksgiving Day, 1942. It was only a few days after receiving Ensign Gene Witter's last letter, dated November 8th, in which he mentioned how he was looking forward to joining the Dean Witter family business after the war. He was buried at sea off the coast of San Cristobal Island on November 13th. A Navy destroyer escort was later named after him, one of 23 Navy ships named after those lost during the battle for Guadalcanal. It also included one ship named for the 5 Sullivan brothers. The Coast Guard went on to name one of its largest ships, U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Monroe, after its heroic signalman. Now stationed in Alaska, Cutter Monroe was for many years stationed in Alameda, California. Before passing away last spring, Ed Wilson made several trips back to the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal. He went with other veterans to remember and pay honor to all of those ordinary men who accomplished the extraordinary in the battle that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Lieutenant Charles Kendrick was hastily buried on a jungle ridge by a party of Marines who bravely slipped behind enemy lines in search for his downed plane. The War Department had no record of the site and had abandoned all efforts to recover his body. Haunted by this fact, in 1947, his father, Charles Kendrick Sr., at age 70, made the difficult journey to Guadalcanal, armed only with a photograph that showed an irregular line of trees in the background. With the help of natives recruited by a local missionary, and after 2 weeks of grueling treks, he finally found his son's wildcat. After 3 days of digging, he found his son. Back at Henderson Field, the missionary arranged a simple mass, and a proud father brought his United States Marine back home to his final resting place in San Francisco. In the words of Admiral Halsey, before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours. The next time you're heading out to Ocean Beach or Land's End, you might want to take a few minutes and visit the USS San Francisco Memorial. It's forged from the remains of its shell-torn bridge. Thank you all for joining us today to honor and pay tribute to those who gallantly fought for our country in the battle for Guadalcanal. Thank you.